They called her Deaf Della, the slow-moving widow who swept her porch every morning and sold cornbread at the Harlan Town Market. His father had found her once, 1857, rode 4 years across Nebraska and Iowa, followed every thread, and finally sat across from her at a farmhouse table outside Omaha, read every letter, saw every document, then stood up, put on his hat, and walked away without making the arrest. Dade Pruitt took that decision to his grave. His son was not going to make the same mistake. It never occurred to a single soul in Harlan that danger had been sweeping her porch on Birch Street every morning for 6 years, that it had been selling them cornbread, that it had been sitting in the third pew of the Methodist Church every Sunday with its hands folded and its gray head bowed. It never occurred to them because they had already decided what Eleanor Cade was. And people rarely look hard at what they think they already understand. They were about to look very hard indeed. She was slow. She was deaf, or close enough to it that you had to repeat yourself twice and speak up considerably on the second attempt. She was pleasant in the vague, undemanding way of old women who have outlived most of what they cared about and made a quiet peace with the remainder. She swept her porch on Birch Street every morning at 7 regardless of weather, sold cornbread at the Tuesday and Friday markets from a stall near the feed store, and occupied the third pew of the Harlan Methodist Church every Sunday with her hands folded and her gray head bowed in an attitude of humble devotion. Sheriff Orrin Buell tipped his hat to her every single morning of those 6 years. She smiled back each time with the grateful pleasure of a woman unused to being noticed. It cost him nothing and made him feel decent, which was the whole transaction and the whole of what he understood about Eleanor Cade. Nobody looked twice. Nobody had any reason to. That was, if you understood anything at all about Eleanor Cade, precisely the point. She returned home from the Friday market at 2:30, bolted her door with the quiet efficiency of long habit, hung her shawl on the peg, and sat down at her kitchen table. The transformation was not dramatic. There was no shaking off of some elaborate disguise. It was simply that the moment the bolt slid home, the performance ended. The slight stoop straightened, the vague expression sharpened, and the woman sitting at the pine table bore about as much resemblance to Deaf Della of Birch Street as a field blade bears to a butter knife. She unfolded the Des Moines newspaper she had purchased that morning from the dry goods store, smoothing it flat with both hands. She read with the focused, unhurried attention of a woman who is not reading for entertainment, but for intelligence, scanning, assessing, cataloging. Page 4, bottom quarter. A small notice, 3 column inches, the kind of announcement that most readers skip entirely. Federal deputy reassignments, Western Iowa counties. Effective December 1st, 1874, a list of names followed. She read each one. Her eyes stopped at the third, Deputy Weston R. Pruitt, assigned Shelby County. Reporting station, Harlan. She read the name twice. Then she set the paper down on the table and sat very still for a moment, her weathered hands resting flat on either side of it. Pruitt. She knew that name. Had known it for 19 years in the way you know the name of a thing that nearly ended you and might yet still. She rose, put the kettle on, and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the bare winter elms of Birch Street, with an expression that was neither fear nor relief, but something older and more complicated than either. The expression of a woman who has been waiting for a particular door to open for a very long time, and has just heard the footsteps on the other side of it. The kettle sang. She made her coffee, sat back down, and picked up the newspaper again. There was a great deal to think about. She had always done her best thinking at this table, in this kitchen, with the Iowa winter pressing quietly against the glass, and nobody in the entire town of Harlan with any idea whatsoever of who was sitting inside these walls. She allowed herself exactly 1 hour of it. Then she folded the paper, finished her coffee, and went to check that the floorboard beneath the old desk was still holding firm. It was. It always was. She straightened up, pressed both hands to the small of her back, and permitted herself the smallest and most private of smiles. Let him come then. She would have the coffee on. Deputy Weston Pruitt rode into Harlan on a gray Tuesday morning that smelled of coming snow, his horse tired and his expression carrying the particular guardedness of a young man determined not to look like what he was, which was 26 years old, 4 months out of the Des Moines federal office, and considerably less certain of himself than his badge suggested. He reported to Sheriff Orrin Buell, who received him in the manner of a man who has learned through long experience that federal deputies sent to quiet counties are either punishment postings or fishing expeditions, and who has no enthusiasm for either. Buell was a broad, unhurried man of 58 with a gray mustache and the disposition of someone who has kept a lid on things for a long time and intends to keep it there. He showed Weston the office, the jail, the deputy's desk, and the coffee pot in that order, and answered every question with the minimum number of words that courtesy required. Weston took a room at the boarding house on Cedar Street run by Ida Foss, a compact and relentlessly observant woman of 52 who had opinions about everyone in Harlan and the conversational stamina to deliver them all before supper. By the time the biscuits arrived, she had covered the Pratt family's ongoing land dispute, Sheriff Buell's complicated relationship with the bottle, the Methodist minister's unfortunate habit of sermons that ran long, and the sweet deaf widow on Birch Street who made the finest cornbread in Shelby County, and whose name was Eleanor Cade. Completely harmless, Ida said, refilling his coffee without being asked. Been here 6 years, quiet as a post. Half the town looks in on her regular. Orrin tips his hat to her every morning like she's the mayor. She paused to consider this. Which is more than he does for the actual mayor, if I'm being honest. Weston ate his supper and said little, which Ida appeared to interpret as encouragement. That night he unpacked his bedroll and his saddlebag in the narrow upstairs room, moving through the routine with the mechanical efficiency of a man whose thoughts are elsewhere. At the bottom of the saddlebag, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and wedged between a spare shirt and his father's Bible, was the reason his thoughts were elsewhere. He set the Bible on the nightstand, opened it to Deuteronomy, where he had found it 3 weeks ago, while settling his father's affairs in a rented room in Council Bluffs. A folded piece of paper so old the creases had gone soft, tucked so deliberately between those specific pages that it could not have been accidental. He unfolded it and read it again by lamplight, though by now he knew every word of it. A wanted notice. Nebraska and Iowa Territories. Issued 1855, a woman. 5'4", brown hair, gray by now, certainly, one distinguishing mark, a diagonal scar across the back of the right hand, acquired during a confrontation with a federal agent outside Omaha in the spring of 1854. Last confirmed sighting. Iowa 1855, status, presumed deceased. The name at the top of the notice was Nora Colvin. Weston's father, Marshall Dade Pruitt, had spent 4 years hunting Nora Colvin across the Nebraska and Iowa territories. Had never caught her. Had retired from federal service in 1860 without explanation and never spoken of the case again. Not once in the 14 years between his retirement and his death last September. Had kept this notice folded in his Bible between the pages of Deuteronomy. Weston stared at it for a long time in the lamplight. Outside, the Harlan wind pushed at the boarding house windows with the flat, determined persistence of an Iowa winter that has a great deal of night left and intends to use it. He refolded the notice and placed it back between the pages, closed the Bible, set it on the nightstand and blew out the lamp. He lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about a deaf old widow on Birch Street who made excellent cornbread, and about the particular way a man hides something in a Bible when he is not ready to act on it but cannot bring himself to destroy it. Sleep was a long time coming. The Friday market in Harlan occupied the open ground beside the feed store on Main Street, a sprawl of canvas-covered stalls and wagon beds that drew most of the county's more population regardless of weather, less because they needed what was sold there, and more because in a town of Harlan's size, the market was the closest thing available to news. Weston arrived at 9:30 with no particular plan, which was the honest truth of it. He told himself he was familiarizing himself with the town. He told himself this with the deliberate casualness of a man who has been telling himself things he does not entirely believe since approximately 4 o'clock that morning. Eleanor Cade's stall was near the feed store entrance, a plain trestle table with a blue cloth, cornbread arranged in neat rows, and Eleanor herself behind it in her gray shawl and her pleasantly vague expression, speaking slowly and loudly to a ranch wife who was speaking slowly and loudly back. They appeared to be enjoying each other enormously. Weston bought a cup of coffee from the stall beside hers and stood back and watched. She moved with the unhurried economy of someone for whom every gesture has long been considered and calibrated. The slight tilt of the head when she didn't quite catch something. The warm, uncertain smile. The way she counted change with her fingers moving slowly over the coins, as though the arithmetic required some effort. Every bit of it was perfect. Every bit of it was, he was becoming increasingly certain, entirely manufactured. Then Boyd Sessler happened. Sessler was a trapper of middling reputation, and considerable whiskey consumption, who appeared at Eleanor's stall at 10:30 with the loose, dangerous amiability of a man who had already started on the bottle before the market opened. He looked at the cash box on the table with the transparent calculation of someone who has made worse decisions than this one and survived them. He reached. What happened next took perhaps 2 seconds in total. The bone-handled knife came from somewhere in the folds of Eleanor's shawl. Not fumbled for, not searched for, but arrived at with the immediate certainty of a hand that has made that particular movement so many thousands of times, it requires no more conscious direction than breathing. Sessler found himself seated on the frozen ground, with the blade at his throat before he had fully processed the transition between standing and falling. The market froze. Eleanor held the knife with the absolute steadiness of a woman whose hand has not trembled under pressure since sometime in the previous decade. The winter light caught the blade. It also caught, with precise and merciless clarity, the back of her right hand. The diagonal scar running clean across it, exactly as described, exactly as drawn in the margin of a 19-year-old notice folded in the pages of Deuteronomy. Weston stood 20 feet away with his coffee cup going cold and completely forgotten in his hand, and felt the blood leave his face in a single, efficient recession. Eleanor looked up from Sessler. She looked directly at Weston. Across the frozen market, across 20 feet of winter air and 19 years of careful disappearance, she looked at him with eyes that were not deaf, not slow, not vague, and not remotely surprised. She had known who he was the moment he rode into town. It was clear in her face, in the absolute absence of shock in it, in the composed and almost patient quality of her gaze. She held his eyes for 3 seconds. Then she released Sessler, who scrambled away on all fours with the chastened urgency of a man who has just been given an expensive lesson at a significant discount. She straightened her shawl, smoothed the blue cloth on her trestle table, and picked up a piece of cornbread. She held it out toward Weston across the market. "You look cold, deputy," she said, in a voice that carried clearly and required no repetition whatsoever. "This'll help." He went to Birch Street that evening at 7 o'clock with his badge on his coat and 3 different versions of an opening speech prepared, none of which he had any real confidence in. Eleanor opened the door before he knocked. She was wearing a plain house dress and an apron, and she had clearly just come from the kitchen. She looked at his badge, then at his face, with the expression of a woman reviewing something she has already thoroughly considered and made her peace with. "I expected you this afternoon," she said. "You must have needed time to think." She stepped back from the door. "Coffee's on the table. Shut that behind you. The wind's coming up." The kitchen was warm and plainly furnished. Pine table, 4 chairs, a wood stove working steadily, a single oil lamp hanging from the beam overhead, 2 tin cups already on the table. She sat down across from him with the settled authority of a woman in her own home conducting a meeting she called, and Weston understood immediately and with some discomfort that this was going to go nothing like any of his 3 prepared speeches. "You're Dade Pruitt's boy," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You have his jaw," she said, studying him without apology. "And his eyes." He had a particular way of looking at a thing he hadn't decided about yet, like he was waiting for it to tell him something. She wrapped her hands around her cup. "You're doing it right now." Weston set the folded wanted notice on the table between them. Eleanor looked at it without touching it. A long moment passed. "Nora Colvin," he said. "That was my name," she said. "A long time ago. It's still the name on a federal warrant. I'm aware." She met his eyes steadily. "Are you going to let me talk, Deputy Pruitt, or are you going to arrest an old woman for cornbread and church attendance?" Weston looked at her. At the notice on the table. At the scar on her hand resting beside her coffee cup, unhidden, unapologetic. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He said, and Eleanor Cade, who had been Nora Colvin before she was anyone else, set down her coffee cup, straightened her back, and began. She talked for 2 weeks. Not continuously. They were not the kind of conversations that ran long on any given evening. Eleanor was precise and economical with language in the way of people who have spent years saying as little as possible, and she gave him information the way a careful card player lays down cards. Deliberately, one at a time, watching his face with each reveal. He came back every night. He told himself it was due diligence. He told himself this with decreasing conviction as the nights went on. The story she laid out was this. In the spring of 1851, Eleanor, Nora, had been 28 years old and working as a bookkeeper for a freight company operating out of Council Bluffs. She was good with numbers, in the way that certain people are good with numbers, meaning that patterns announce themselves to her in columns of figures, the way words announce themselves to a reader, naturally and without effort. It was this gift that first showed her something was wrong with the federal payroll shipments moving through the company's routes into the Nebraska territory. The discrepancies were small, intentionally small, the kind of small that assumes nobody is paying close enough attention to catch them. Nora caught them. She followed the thread backward through 4 years of ledgers and forward through a network of subsidiary freight contracts, and what she found at the end of it was Governor Harlan Beckett's signature on a set of agreements that redirected a systematic percentage of federal homestead development funds into a land acquisition operation that was, with quiet efficiency, bankrupting and displacing the very families those funds were meant to support. She had gone to the federal office in Council Bluffs with her ledgers. The agent she spoke to was polite, thorough, and, she understood within a week, entirely in Beckett's employ. Her ledgers disappeared. She was dismissed from her bookkeeping position the following Monday. 2 men she did not recognize began appearing on her street. She had 2 choices: disappear quietly or do something. Nora Colvin had never been particularly good at quiet. The first payroll wagon she took carried $9,000 in federal funds earmarked through Beckett's operation for the purchase of a homestead parcel outside Sioux City whose family had no idea their land was already sold. That money went to the Deller family on a Tuesday morning in cash in a saddlebag, left on their porch before dawn without a note. The second wagon carried $12,000, the third $7,000. Over 4 years across Nebraska and Iowa, she redistributed $61,000 with the methodical precision of a woman working from a very specific list. She kept copies of everything, every ledger page, every transfer document, every letter bearing Beckett's signature. She had kept them for 19 years in a leather satchel under a floorboard beneath the desk in the next room. Weston pushed back at everything. Every night he came armed with the specific objections of a man trained in federal law who is fighting a losing battle against a more complicated truth than his training prepared him for. He challenged dates. She produced dates. He challenged amounts. She produced ledger copies. He challenged her accounting of where the money went. She gave him names, families, locations, amounts that he could and did verify against county land records, and that checked out every time. The hardest night was the 5th one, when she told him about the federal agent outside Omaha in the spring of 1854. The confrontation that had produced the scar on her hand, and the agent's report that had produced the wanted notice. The agent had not been attempting to arrest her. He had been attempting to recover a specific set of documents she was carrying that would have been, in the wrong hands, a death warrant for 3 homestead families in the Platte River Valley. She had not given them up. Weston sat with that for a long time. "My father hunted you for 4 years," he said finally. "He did," Eleanor said. "He never caught you." "No. Did he ever get close?" Eleanor looked at him across the lamplit table for a moment. "Once," she said. "But that is a story for another night. And I think," she added, rising to refill his coffee with the unhurried manner of a woman entirely in command of her own kitchen, "that you have enough to think about for this one." It was Dora Hensley, wife of the grain merchant 2 houses down from Eleanor on Birch Street, who first noticed the deputy's horse tied outside Eleanor's gate on a Tuesday evening. She mentioned it to Cora Fitch at the dry goods store on Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, it had reached Gerald Pratt, who owned the largest hardware concern in Harlan, and had strong opinions about the proper conduct of federal law enforcement and the general unreliability of Eastern appointees. By Sunday, the Methodist Church was vibrating with it. Pratt convened what he called an informal meeting of concerned citizens in the back room of his hardware store on Monday evening and delivered a speech about the rule of law, the integrity of the federal system, and the absolute necessity of Sheriff Buell acting immediately and decisively. He used the word immediately 4 times. He had not spoken personally to Weston, reviewed the wanted notice, or possessed any information beyond the bare fact of the deputy's evening visits, but these absences did not appear to diminish his certainty. Buell listened to all of it with the expression of a man sitting in weather he did not cause and cannot change. He said he would look into it. He went home and sat at his own kitchen table and looked into the bottom of a glass of rye whiskey instead, because Orrin Buell was a decent man in the specific way that makes certain situations almost unbearable. decent enough to know that whatever was happening on Birch Street was more complicated than Gerald Pratt's version of it, and not quite brave enough yet to say so out loud. The countercurrent was quieter, but it ran deep. Nettie Dawson, whose family had ranched in Shelby County for 20 years and bought Eleanor's cornbread every Friday without fail, told Pratt to his face that she would believe Deaf Della was a federal outlaw the same day she believed her own grandmother was Jesse James. Reuben Alcott, the livery owner, said nothing publicly but made it known through the specific medium of loaded silence that he considered the entire business premature. Ida Foss, who had opinions on everything and the social standing to deploy them freely, delivered a 17-minute assessment of Gerald Pratt's credibility and judgment to anyone who would listen at the Tuesday market that left very little standing. But the telegram arrived on Thursday. Buell brought it to Weston at the deputy's desk in the sheriff's office and set it down without comment. It was from the federal office in Council Bluffs, signed by a name Weston did not recognize but whose title he recognized very well. Marshall Cutter Hayes was riding to Harlan. He would arrive within the week. The matter was to be held in its current state pending his arrival. Weston read the telegram twice. Buell watched him read it. "You know Hayes?" Buell asked. "By reputation," Weston said. Buell waited. "He is not a man who rides out personally to collect a 61-year-old woman on a 19-year-old warrant," Weston said carefully, "unless the warrant is not the primary reason for the ride." Buell looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat, put it on, and walked to the door. "I'll be at the Foss house for supper if you need me," he said. "Don't do anything I can't explain to my wife." He went out and closed the door. Joe Weston sat at the desk and looked at the telegram and thought about a leather satchel under a floorboard and about a federal operation that had run for years behind the name of a governor, and about how many people between Harlan and the current territorial administration in Des Moines might have a very strong interest in that satchel never seeing the light of a courtroom. He picked up his hat and coat and walked to Birch Street. Eleanor had the coffee on before he knocked. She brought the satchel up from beneath the floorboard without ceremony, the way you retrieve something you have retrieved 10,000 times in your imagination for 19 years, and have therefore already performed every possible version of this moment long before it arrived. It was old leather, dark with age, the buckle tarnished but sound. She set it on the kitchen table between them and unbuckled it without drama, and laid out its contents in the lamplight with the quiet precision of a woman presenting evidence she has curated and organized and maintained for nearly 2 decades against exactly this occasion. Weston did not touch anything immediately. He looked first at the volume of it, at the organization of it, at the handwriting on the tab dividers she had made from folded paper that separated one category of document from the next. There was a ledger index, a correspondence file, a series of transfer documents arranged chronologically, a set of land survey records, and at the back, in a separate oilskin sleeve, a collection of letters in a handwriting he did not recognize but whose signature he recognized immediately, and with a cold, settling certainty in the pit of his stomach. Governor Harlan Beckett, dated between 1849 and 1855. He read for a long time. Eleanor sat across from him and drank her coffee and did not rush him and did not watch his face with any particular urgency, in the manner of a woman who knows what the documents say and has long since processed her own reaction to them. The letters were explicit in the way that corrupt men's letters are explicit when they believe absolutely in the security of their communication. Beckett did not use euphemism. He used figures, names, dates, instructions. He used the language of a man managing a business operation, which was precisely what it was, with the federal homestead program as its funding mechanism and the territorial land registry as its instrument. $61,000 was a conservative accounting. The full figure, across the breadth of what the letters documented, was closer to $200,000. Weston set the last letter down. The kitchen was very quiet. The wood stove ticked and breathed. Outside, the Harlan wind moved through the winter elms on Birch Street with its familiar flat persistence. "Why did you never use these?" he asked. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Eleanor looked at him across the table. "I tried once," she said, 1856. "I was in Omaha under a different name. I went to a federal land office with copies, not these, copies and a written account. The agent took my copies and my account and told me to come back in a week." She paused. "2 men were waiting outside when I left. I did not go back. You could have tried again. Different city, different office." A woman who robbed federal payroll wagons in 4 states, Eleanor said, with a patience that was not unkindness, but something close to it, does not walk into a federal courthouse with a leather satchel and receive a fair hearing. Not in 1856, not in 1864, not today, she held his gaze. But a federal deputy with a clean record and his father's name and a badge that nobody has yet found reason to question, that is a different matter entirely. Weston looked at the satchel, at the letters, at the woman across the table who had carried all of this through 19 years of cornbread and Methodist church and porch, sweeping and careful, patient, relentless waiting. "My father," he said. "You said he got close once." Eleanor set her cup down. "He found me," she said simply, "outside Omaha in the winter of 1857. He had been following a thread in the land records for 6 months, and it led him to the farmhouse where I was staying." She paused. "He sat where you are sitting now. He read what you have just read. He sat with it for a very long time." Her voice was steady and without performance. "Then he stood up, put on his hat, and walked out. He did not arrest me. He did not report the location. He simply left. The lamp flickered in a draft from somewhere." "He never caught you," Weston said slowly. "He closed the case and retired 3 years later and never spoke of it. He was trying to decide what to do with what he knew," Eleanor said. "Same as you are right now." She looked at him steadily. "He ran out of time. I have been hoping, Deputy Pruitt, that you will not." Weston looked at his father's badge on his coat, at the letters spread across the pine table, at the 19 years of careful evidence laid out before him by a woman who had bet everything, including the 19 years, on the possibility that a Pruitt would eventually sit in this chair and be capable of doing what his father could not. He did not sleep that night. Cutter Hayes arrived on a Thursday morning that was so cold, the air itself seemed brittle, riding a black horse with 2 deputies behind him and the particular bearing of a man who considers his own arrival sufficient resolution to most situations. He was 50 iron gray, with a federal marshal's star that caught the winter light and a manner that suggested he had been polishing both for roughly the same length of time. He went directly to the sheriff's office, did not remove his coat, and shook Buell's hand with the efficiency of a man crossing items off a list. Weston was already there. Hayes looked at him with the measuring expression of a superior officer, reviewing a subordinate he has already assessed at a distance and found wanting. "Pruitt," he said, "I've read your report." "I haven't filed a report," Weston said. A pause. "I've read Buell's account of the situation." Hayes moved to the desk, placed his hat on it with the deliberate ownership of a man establishing territorial claim. "This is straightforward. There's a federal warrant 19 years outstanding for a woman currently residing in this county. You've located her. You'll take me to her this morning. She'll be processed and transported to Council Bluffs, and this office will file a report stating that the intelligence which led to her location proved upon investigation to be unsubstantiated." He looked at Weston. "The woman herself will recant any statements made to you in the course of your investigation." The room was very still. Buell stood at the window, looking at the street outside with the expression of a man who has suddenly found the frost patterns on the glass extremely interesting. "She has documents," Weston said carefully. "Original correspondence implicating a former territorial governor and a network of federal officials in a land fraud operation running to $200,000. The warrant against her is directly connected to that operation. She was targeted because of what she knew, not because of what she took." Deputy Pruitt. Hayes's voice carried the flat authority of a man who has used it to end conversations for 30 years. "I am not here to review the merits of a convicted outlaw's self-serving account of her own crimes. I am here to execute a federal warrant. You will accompany me to the woman's residence this morning, or you will surrender your badge to Sheriff Buell, and we will proceed without you. Those are the available options." Weston looked at him. He thought about his father sitting across from Eleanor Cade in a farmhouse outside Omaha in the winter of 1857. He thought about a man who had read the letters and understood the truth of them and stood up and put on his hat and walked away and spent the rest of his life with that decision sitting somewhere inside him that nothing could quite reach. He thought about a wanted notice folded in the pages of Deuteronomy, kept for 14 years, passed on without explanation, as though his father had known, had hoped, that whoever found it might be able to do what he himself had not. "No, sir," Weston said. Hayes looked at him. "I will not accompany you to that residence," Weston said. "I will not file a false report." and I will not participate in the suppression of documentary evidence of federal corruption. He reached up and unpinned the badge from his coat and set it on the desk in front of Hayes with a steadiness in his hand that surprised him. Those are my available options. Hayes looked at the badge, at Weston, back at the badge. You understand what this means for your career, he said. Yes, sir, Weston said. I expect I do. He picked up his hat and coat. He looked at Buell, who was still facing the window, who had not moved or spoken, but whose right hand had tightened on the window frame in a way that told Weston everything he needed to know about where Orrin Buell actually stood. He went out and closed the door quietly behind him. He walked to the livery, saddled his horse, and rode to Birch Street. Eleanor answered the door with her coat already on and the leather satchel already in her hand, as though she had been standing at the window watching for exactly this. How long do we have? She asked. Hours, he said, maybe less. She nodded once, locked her door, came down the porch steps without looking back at the house. They rode for Des Moines before noon. The ride to Des Moines took 2 days through country that was flat and gray and cold, and entirely indifferent to the urgency of the two people crossing it. Eleanor rode with the leather satchel across her lap and spoke little, which suited Weston, who had a great deal to think about and no useful conclusions yet to show for it. They stopped one night at a farmstead outside Adel, whose owners asked no questions, which in the Iowa winter of 1874 was a hospitality as generous as any amount of conversation. They arrived at the federal land office in Des Moines on a Saturday morning, and Weston walked in without an appointment, without a badge, and without anything except a leather satchel, a signed testimony from a woman the federal government had listed as deceased for 19 years, and the specific quality of certainty that belongs to people who have recently made an irreversible decision and found it, surprisingly, easier to live with than the alternative. The document examiner who received them was a careful, bespectacled man named Aldous Farron, whose professional instincts proved, fortunately, stronger than his political ones. He read the letters with the focused attention of a man who understands what he is looking at and is running, behind his composed expression, a rapid calculation of its implications. He read for a long time. Then he set the last letter down, removed his spectacles, and looked at the two people sitting across his desk, a former outlaw of 61 and a former deputy of 26, with an expression that had moved some considerable distance from where it began. I'll need to hold these, he said carefully. They don't leave this building, Weston said, and I'll need a receipt. Farron looked at him for a moment. Then he reached for his pen. What followed moved with the grinding, impersonal momentum of institutional machinery that has been set in motion by something it cannot stop. It was slow and it was unglamorous, and it bore almost no resemblance to justice as Weston had once imagined it. Clean, swift, and proportionate. Real justice, he was learning, moved like the Iowa winter. Heavy and cold and arriving on its own schedule regardless of anyone's preferences. Cutter Hayes was recalled to Des Moines for a formal inquiry within the week. He resigned before the inquiry concluded, which was understood by everyone involved to be a confession of a kind that the formal process would not quite have produced. 3 officials of the current territorial administration, with documented connections to Beckett's original operation, followed him into resignation over the following 3 months. The Council Bluffs federal office underwent a review that produced 2 criminal referrals. The case against Eleanor, such as it was, built as it was on charges that any honest reading of the satchel's contents rendered not merely questionable but actively absurd, was reviewed by a federal judge in Des Moines named Harlan Webb, who had the particular quality of judicial temperament that consists largely of being too old and too secure in his position to care about political consequences. He reviewed the warrant, the letters, the land records, the testimony, and the documented history of what the payroll wagon proceeds had actually funded, and he dismissed the charges in a written opinion that was 3 pages long and contained, in its second page, a passage about the nature of justice and the obligations of federal institutions that was later reprinted in 3 Iowa newspapers and caused considerable discomfort in several offices that deserved it. Eleanor walked out of the Des Moines Federal Building on a gray February morning into air that was cold and bright and carried, just barely, the first tentative suggestion that the season was thinking about changing. Weston was on the steps. His federal obstruction charge took 14 months to resolve and cost him 18 months of legal uncertainty and a great deal of sleep. At the end of it, with Hayes gone and the institutional climate somewhat altered. It was dismissed on the same grounds as Eleanor's, insufficient basis in law when the full context of the matter was properly considered. Judge Webb wrote that opinion too, with what appeared to be a certain dry satisfaction. Back in Harlan, Orrin Buell had done the thing that Weston suspected he would do the moment he saw that tightened hand on the window frame. He had let Hayes search Eleanor's house, because refusing would have ended his career and helped no one. But he had also, quietly and without announcement, made certain that Eleanor's personal effects, her good wool shawl, her sewing box, her Bible, were boxed up and held at the sheriff's office rather than disposed of. When Eleanor came back to Birch Street in late March, he was on the porch of her house with a hammer and a new lock, replacing the one Hayes's men had forced. He did not explain himself. She did not ask him to. Gerald Pratt had the grace to say nothing publicly, which was the closest he was capable of coming to an apology, and was accepted in that spirit by people too wise to press for more. Ida Foss, by contrast, had a great deal to say and said all of it at considerable volume at the Tuesday market, and the general consensus in Harlan by the time spring arrived was approximately what Nettie Dawson had said from the beginning, that they had known all along that Deaf Della was no criminal, and that the federal government would do well to spend less time pursuing elderly widows and more time examining its own affairs. This was not entirely accurate as a historical account, but it was what a town tells itself when it is trying to absorb something that does not fit comfortably into the story it has been keeping about itself. And Weston had learned enough by now to understand that certain corrections are better made quietly than publicly. Eleanor went back to her porch on Birch Street. She swept it every morning at 7. She returned to the Tuesday and Friday markets with her cornbread, which people bought with the slightly heightened enthusiasm of customers who are also, in some inarticulate way, offering an apology. She sat in the third pew of the Methodist Church every Sunday, but she no longer tilted her head as though she hadn't quite caught what the minister was saying, and she no longer counted her change with slow fingers. And when Sheriff Buell tipped his hat to her on his morning rounds, she looked back at him with eyes that were sharp and clear and entirely, unambiguously present. The performance was over. She was simply Eleanor now, not Deaf Della, not Nora Colvin, not a wanted notice in a dead man's Bible. Just a woman on Birch Street in Harlan, Iowa, who had done what she believed was right and paid an enormous price for it over a very long time, and who had come out the other side of that time still standing, still sharp, still entirely herself. Weston came back to Harlan in the fall. He had no particular plan beyond returning the borrowed horse he had left in Buell's livery, which was technically the only obligation remaining. He stayed 3 weeks, then the winter, and then another spring, and somewhere in the course of that second spring it became clear to everyone in Harlan, including eventually himself, that he was not leaving. Buell offered him the deputy position again. He accepted without excessive deliberation. On a warm June evening, he sat on Eleanor's porch on Birch Street with a cup of coffee going pleasantly cold in his hand, watching the last of the daylight drain out of the wide Iowa sky, and Eleanor sat beside him in her rocking chair with her own coffee and the settled, private contentment of a woman whose accounts are finally, after 19 years, square with the world. "Your father would have done it," Weston said. It was something he had been thinking for a long time. Eleanor rocked once, considered. "I know," she said. He simply needed more time than he had. She looked out at the elm-lined street, at the last amber light on the houses, at the town going quietly about its evening. "That is the only tragedy in it, I think. Not what happened, just the time." The elm leaves moved in the warm June air. Somewhere down the street a dog barked once and fell silent. Harlan, Iowa settled into its summer evening with the unhurried ease of a place that has returned to its own rhythms after a disruption it is still, and will likely always be, trying to fully understand. On the third pew of the Methodist Church the following Sunday, Eleanor Cade sat with her hands folded and her head clear and her eyes wide open, and the congregation sat around her in the plain wooden pews, and the minister preached about truth and its obligations, and nobody in the building looked twice at the woman in the third pew. For the first time in 19 years, that was not because she had arranged it that way. It was simply because she was home. If Eleanor Cade's story grabbed you by the collar and refused to let go, if that knife scene stopped your breath and that final porch evening settled something in your chest, then you already know this channel is worth staying close to. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting, and it will find you exactly when you need it.